It was supposed to be like every other afternoon, the kind of simple, quiet day small villages are known for. Children playing, parents chatting, bicycles resting near fences. But when 8-year-old Johanna Bonakar pedaled toward the playground, that warm September afternoon in 1999, nobody imagined she was riding straight into a moment that would haunt her family for decades. She left home smiling. She never returned. By dinner time, when her seat at the kitchen table sat empty, her parents first felt that small, sharp edge of unease, the feeling that something ordinary had suddenly gone wrong. They called neighbors, walked the paths, checked the swings, and slides. Her bicycle was found leaning against a fence, exactly where she had left it, but Johanna herself was gone. As the sun set over the small village of Randstadt, Germany, the search began. At first it was hopeful, then desperate, then terrifying. Hundreds searched, police, neighbors, fire brigades, combing every tree line, every ditch, every quiet corner where a child could have wandered. But the longer they looked, the colder. The trail grew. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, no scream anyone heard. The only thing left behind was silence, the kind of silence that doesn't explain itself, the kind that settles into a parent's chest like a permanent weight. Days turned to weeks. Weeks became months. Slowly, the village returned to normal. But inside Johanna's home, time froze. Her room sat untouched, the drawings, the toys, the little jacket still hanging by the door, all waiting as if she might walk in at any moment. For nearly 2 decades, her parents lived trapped between hope and grief, never knowing which was worse. Because as long as Johanna was missing, there was still room for a tiny, unbearable kind of hope. What none of them knew was that somewhere buried deep within one tiny, overlooked detail, the truth had been sitting quietly, waiting to be discovered. In the early days after Johanna's disappearance, hope was the only thing keeping her parents standing. Every knock at the door, every phone call brought a brief spark of desperate anticipation. Maybe someone saw something. Maybe she was found. But each time it was nothing, no new lead, no sighting, only quiet apologies from police officers who had run out of answers. The small village of Randstadt tried to comfort the Bonnecker family, but even kind words could not fill the hole left in their home. Neighbors left food on the porch. The church held vigils. Posters of Johanna's smiling face were taped to trees, telephone poles, and store windows. Her bright eyes and soft blonde hair became hauntingly familiar to everyone in town. For the police, the early investigation quickly ran into walls. There was no sign of forced abduction at the playground. The bicycle wasn't damaged. There were no signs of struggle or violence nearby, and in small towns like Randstadt, there are rarely strangers. The immediate fear settled in. If not a stranger, then who? Detectives began questioning everyone close to Johanna, her family. Of course, her school teachers, friends' parents, local shop owners, even distant relatives who lived out of town were interviewed. Her parents cooperated fully, answering every painful question, every uncomfortable suspicion. No criminal background, no family conflict, nothing suspicious in the home. They were simply a loving family who had lost their little girl. As the days passed, the investigation shifted outward. The police set up roadblocks. Drivers were questioned. Farmers, delivery men, anyone who might have passed through the area that day was asked to come forward. The media reported Johanna's case across Germany, hoping a wider audience might bring information. And yet nothing. After 3 weeks, detectives received one of their first and only external tips. A man reported seeing a brown Volkswagen Jetta parked near the area that afternoon. The driver was described as a man with long hair tied back, possibly in a ponytail, but no license plate was recorded, no clear face seen, no further details. Investigators ran the lead down exhaustively. They checked thousands of registered vehicles matching that description across multiple regions. Dozens of interviews were conducted with car owners, many of whom had no connection whatsoever to Randstadt. But still, no match. The trail went cold quickly, and with no further leads. Frustration began to settle deep inside both the investigators and Johanna's parents. For her mother, the worst part was not knowing whether to hope or mourn. She left Johanna's room untouched for years, refusing to box up the small clothes or school books. Every birthday passed like a wound reopening. Though the town slowly returned to its routines for Johanna's family, life stood frozen at that. One terrible moment in 1999, as the case grew colder, theories floated like whispers. Was it someone passing through town? Was it a local hiding in plain sight? Was it an accident covered up or something even worse? Detective teams changed over the years. Files were transferred, officers retired. New technology entered police work, but the case files gathered dust in storage rooms, but not for everyone. For her mother, each day remained the same. Every night she would sit near the window, sometimes for hours, staring out into the street as though waiting for Johanna to walk up the driveway. Even as years passed, even after the media moved on, she couldn't stop waiting. And then came the turning point, not because of a new witness, not because of a confession, not because of new surveillance, but because of one small, overlooked detail buried inside those old files. A detail that, for nearly 2 decades, had sat unnoticed. A silent witness had always been there, waiting. Years slipped by. Seasons changed, neighbors moved, children in the village grew older, but Johanna's absence never aged. For her parents, it remained 1999. Every single morning, they woke up to the same pain. The police still received occasional calls. Some claimed to have seen a girl who looked like Johanna at bus stops, train stations, even in other cities. But every lead ended the same way: mistaken identity, dead end. The local police officially marked the case as unsolved, active but dormant. By the 5th year, behind those carefully chosen words was a simple truth: they had nothing. For Johanna's mother, the silence grew heavier. Every normal day was a quiet reminder of what was missing. Friends stopped asking questions. Neighbors stopped bringing food. The town stopped whispering. The world had moved on, except for one house. Her bedroom stayed exactly as it was. The small backpack still hung on its hook. The drawings she made in school were still taped to the wall. On her 9th birthday, her mother quietly placed a single cupcake by the window. A candle flickered. There was no one to blow it out. Even in a small village, people eventually get used to unsolved mysteries. That is perhaps the cruelest part of grief, but behind closed doors, Johanna's parents never stopped writing letters to politicians, to cold case departments, to anyone who might listen. For years, their words were met with polite sympathy but no real action. By the 10th anniversary of Johanna's disappearance, the case had grown colder than anyone wanted to admit. Even police investigators who once worked tirelessly had retired or been reassigned. The new generation of officers inherited the file, a thick box filled with reports, transcripts, maps, photographs, but no answers. And yet, buried inside that box, hidden in plain sight for all these years, sat one tiny detail: the fiber. During the first few days of the investigation, crime scene technicians had collected several trace materials from Johanna's abandoned bicycle. Among them was a single, thin fiber clinging to the bike's frame. At the time, forensic technology was limited. The fiber was logged, packaged, and stored with hundreds of other small pieces of evidence labeled, filed, forgotten. But in 2016, everything quietly changed. Germany had been slowly upgrading its forensic departments, funding specialized cold case units, digitizing old files, and re-examining evidence with modern tools never available in the 90s. One such task force, simply called Project Johanna, was created quietly under public pressure, led by a small team who refused to let the case die. When the cold case team reopened the files, they started from zero: no assumptions, no theories, no shortcuts. Every interview was reread, every item of evidence retested. That forgotten fiber was finally reanalyzed with modern forensic microscopes. What they found stunned the team. The fiber didn't match Johanna's clothing, nor her bicycle seat, nor any natural elements near the playground. Instead, it was a synthetic carpet fiber, extremely specific in color and composition, the kind typically found inside certain cars or private interiors, not outdoors. The single thread had been sitting in storage for nearly 17 years, holding the only real clue anyone ever had. Suddenly, the question changed entirely. Whose carpet fiber was this, and where had it come from that day? For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the investigation wasn't looking backward anymore. It was moving forward. Somewhere out there, someone had crossed paths with Johanna that afternoon. Someone whose world was about to collapse. The discovery of the fiber changed everything. For the first time in years, detectives had something they could chase, something physical, something real. The cold case team began methodically reconstructing every detail of Johanna's last day, but now with fresh eyes. They returned to the witness statements. One name appeared again. 17 years earlier, a man had been briefly questioned in the early days of the investigation, a local mechanic named Rick J. at the time. He had owned a brown Volkswagen Jetta, the same model one witness claimed to have seen parked near the playground, but back then his alibi had seemed solid. He claimed to be out of town visiting family. No one could directly place him near the scene, and with no forensic evidence, police had no grounds to pursue him further. But now, there was a carpet fiber. Detectives obtained the full model data of the 1990s Volkswagen Jetta interiors. The composition of the car's factory carpet matched closely with the synthetic fiber pulled from Johanna's bicycle. The investigation team quietly reopened Rick J's entire profile. What they found was unsettling. He had a record nothing that screamed immediate danger back in 1999. Just a few minor charges, some troubling but nonviolent offenses as a teenager. But as they dug deeper, a far darker pattern began to surface. Rick J. had a history of inappropriate behavior toward young girls, mostly dismissed, minimized, or quietly settled without convictions. Small towns don't always know how to handle those warning signs until it's too late. Over the years, Rick J. had lived quietly. Never married, no children, no serious relationships. He still lived not far from Randstad, quiet, ordinary, invisible. The detectives began slow, quiet surveillance. They didn't want to scare him off, not yet. They revisited his old alibi. The family member he had claimed to visit back in 1999 had passed away years ago. No records could verify his trip, no receipts, no phone logs, nothing. It was, in reality, a hole no one had seen before, or perhaps no one had wanted to see. The team then quietly obtained a search warrant. Rick J. had recently moved to a small house on the edge of town. When officers entered the residence, they didn't expect what they would find. Inside his garage were boxes that should have held ordinary junk, old tools, papers, spare parts. But buried underneath layers of dust was something else entirely. They found old VHS tapes, unlabeled CDs and DVDs, drawings of children crude. Disturbing, obsessive, and, more importantly, several large bags filled with old clothing, dolls, and small children's belongings. Forensics moved carefully. Among the items was a child's hairbrush. The hair collected from its bristles was sent immediately to the lab. When the results returned, they confirmed the worst. The hair belonged to Johanna Bonneker. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was murder. And all along, Rick J. had been hiding quietly in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. The man the police once questioned and dismissed was now the prime suspect. But still, there were questions. Big questions. What exactly happened to Johanna that day? How did he lure her? Where did he take her? What was done? And why had he kept these trophies for so long? The answers were coming, but not yet. Because the case, after all these years, was only just beginning to open. The discovery of Johanna's hairbrush inside Rick J.'s storage shook the investigators. Forensics confirmed the match. The evidence was damning. And yet there was still one haunting truth. They had not found Johanna, not her remains, not a location, not a single clue confirming what had ultimately happened to her. For her mother, this created a different kind of agony. If they can't find her, she whispered one night to Karen, one of the lead cold case detectives, then maybe she's still out there somewhere. The detectives couldn't bring themselves to take that hope away from her because even they didn't fully know yet. Without a body, without a crime scene, there was always that tiny window of impossible hope. As the investigation deepened, The team turned its focus to Rick J's behavior patterns. They interviewed anyone who had ever known him. One former coworker recalled how Rick was always quiet, polite, almost too polite. Another neighbor described how Rick would offer to help with small tasks, especially when children were around. He was always willing to fix a bike chain, pump a tire, or lend a hand with small repairs. He liked being near children, the neighbor admitted uneasily. But we just thought he was being kind. The signs had been there, but no one had truly seen them, or perhaps no one had wanted to. When police dug further into Rick's history, disturbing patterns emerged. In his late teens, Rick had once been accused of inappropriate contact with a younger girl in a neighboring town. The case never went to trial. The family moved away, and charges were quietly dropped. In his early 20s, there were more rumors. He had worked briefly at a carnival operating children's rides. Complaints had been filed about odd behavior, but nothing ever stuck. He lived his life quietly, skillfully, remaining invisible to authorities. But those who study predators know silence doesn't mean safety. Back at the station, investigators carefully re-examined the old timeline. How did Johanna end up in Rick J's orbit that day? Did he approach her at the playground? Did he lure her with something? Or was it planned long before? There was one subtle clue that haunted Karen. During the initial interviews back in 1999, one of Johanna's young classmates had mentioned something, almost entirely overlooked at the time. She said she was going to show someone her new drawing, but no one had ever figured out who that someone was. Was it an innocent comment, a friend, or was it Rick J? Investigators now theorize that Rick may have carefully groomed Johanna over time, perhaps posing as a friendly neighbor or someone she trusted. It wouldn't have taken much for an 8-year-old child to feel safe approaching a familiar face, but even with this working theory, one haunting possibility kept everyone awake. If he had groomed her, could he have also kept her alive? Karen voiced what many were thinking but afraid to say. We cannot rule out that he may have moved her somewhere, kept her hidden. Some abductors do. There were rare but real cases where children had been held captive for years isolated, manipulated, controlled. Until they found concrete evidence otherwise, they had to keep that possibility alive. For Johanna's mother, that fragile hope became both salvation and torment. Maybe she's still out there, she whispered again and again. Maybe he's still hiding her. Investigators shifted part of their focus. If there was even the smallest chance Johanna was alive, they couldn't afford to miss it. They searched Rick's property again. Dogs swept every inch. Deep ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan for hidden spaces, basements, or makeshift rooms. Nothing was found. But Rick's financial records revealed something curious. For several years after Johanna's disappearance, Rick had periodically rented small storage units across different towns' short-term rentals, paid in cash under variations of his name. Could one of those places have been where Johanna was taken? Could she have been moved over the years? The team tracked down the old rental sites. Most had long been cleared out or re-rented, but one abandoned unit, located over 40 kilometers away, was still accessible. The team moved quickly. They feared what they might find, but hoped for something they could finally call closure. When the rusted door rolled open, the investigators stood in tense silence. Inside were dusty, empty shelves, a few discarded items, old boxes filled mostly with garbage. But tucked far into the back corner was a child's small, pink backpack. The officers froze. The initials stitched carefully into the fabric confirmed it. J.B. Johanna Bonneker. The backpack was carefully sealed as evidence. Inside were school papers, a small hair clip, and one of her favorite colored pencils. But still, there was no sign of Johanna herself. The find only deepened the mystery. Had she been here once? Had he moved her again? Was she still alive somewhere? And for her mother, that unbearable hope continued. Because as long as Johanna's body wasn't found, there was still one door that hadn't fully closed, the discovery of Johanna's backpack inside. Rick J's old storage unit had finally shattered any remaining doubt. The investigators were now certain Johanna had been in his possession. But one question still haunted them all. For how long? With enough probable cause established, police filed for a comprehensive search warrant. Rick J's property would be searched top to bottom, this time with no restrictions. When officers entered his home again, they approached with careful precision. They weren't looking for circumstantial evidence anymore. They were looking for his private world, and they found it inside one of the locked cabinets in his small bedroom closet were several sealed containers. The first box revealed disturbing items, children's toys, dolls, school notebooks, clothing far too small for any adult to own. But it was what they found in the second and third containers that turned the stomachs of even the most experienced investigators. Dozens of CDs, DVDs, and portable hard drives, all carefully labeled, cataloged, and organized. What was on those drives would leave no more room for denial. Forensic tech teams carefully reviewed the contents. The digital files contained years of inappropriate, illegal, and deeply disturbing material involving minors, the kind of footage investigators dread to encounter. Much of it had been downloaded from illegal networks. But buried inside were files that appeared to be self-recorded personal footage. In several of these private clips, Rick J. himself could be seen filming public playgrounds, schoolyards, and fairs, carefully tracking children as they played, often zooming in on young girls. There was no direct footage of Johanna, but the pattern was unmistakable. His obsession had spanned years, if not decades. Karen, standing quietly at the review desk, whispered what everyone feared. This wasn't random. He was actively hunting, watching, cataloging. The detectives could no longer rule out the terrifying possibility that Johanna may not have been his first victim, or possibly not his last intended one. Psychological profilers joined the task force. They reviewed Rick's digital files, journals, and past behaviors, slowly building a far more sinister portrait. Rick J. fit the profile of what investigators call a long-term collector. These are not impulsive offenders. They operate in the shadows for years, sometimes decades, feeding their obsessions privately while blending into everyday society. On the surface, quiet, polite, unassuming. Inside, calculated, dangerous, fully detached from empathy. Rick's neighbors still found it impossible to believe. He was quiet, kept to himself, one said. Never caused any trouble. He even helped at church once in a while. That was the mask. Beneath it sat years of darkness that no one had seen, or perhaps never dared to see. And yet, through all of this, one agonizing truth remained. Johanna still had not been found. Her mother clung desperately to that thin thread of hope. If they can't find her, she repeated in quiet moments, then maybe he moved her. Maybe she's somewhere. Investigators kept that possibility alive because, until there was proof of death, the chance of life remained, even if that chance was painfully small. Meanwhile, detectives expanded their search zones. They went back into Rick's rental histories. They began interviewing anyone who had ever rented storage space near him. They searched nearby cabins, hunting lodges, even remote garden allotments he once tended. Nothing. Weeks passed. Then months, but the haunting questions remained as heavy as ever. Had she died early on? Had she been hidden for years? Was there a location no one had found yet? One of the profilers quietly said what none of them wanted to hear aloud. In cases like this, the lack of a body after this much time often means deliberate concealment. The search was far from over because somewhere, either in the ground or beyond it, the full truth about Johanna still waited, and Rick J. wasn't talking. The silent witness they needed had not yet spoken fully, but its voice was getting louder by now. The investigation team had enough evidence to fully charge Rick J., but even with the mounting digital proof, the forensic links, and the overwhelming circumstantial trail, there was still no clear answer to the one question everyone feared most. Where was Johanna? The district prosecutor authorized extended questioning sessions, but Rick J. remained cold, detached, emotionless. I never touched that girl, he repeated. I don't know how her things ended up there. His calm voice sent chills through the interrogation rooms. There was no panic, no anger, no remorse. Criminal profilers warned the team. He won't give you the satisfaction of confession, People like him rarely do. They live in their own private world where their fantasies are the only truth. And, Rick J. had built that private world carefully, piece by piece, for years. The analysis of his computers revealed even more chilling details. Hidden folders were recovered, many encrypted, containing hundreds of images of young girls from parks and schools over decades. Long spreadsheets with personal notes, estimated ages, hair colors, and approximate locations where he had seen them. Surveillance-style photographs, clearly taken without consent. Among those files were multiple pictures believed to have been taken of Johanna, captured secretly long before the day she vanished, small, candid photos, some at the playground, others while she walked home from school, always from a distance, always calculated. The realization was horrifying. Rick hadn't stumbled upon Johanna randomly. That afternoon he had been watching her, studying her routines, waiting for the right moment. And perhaps worst of all, Johanna never even knew she was being watched. For her mother, hearing these details was almost unbearable. He was near her for how long, and we never saw it, she broke down in one of her many meetings with the lead detectives. Karen gently placed her hand over hers. You couldn't have known, Lavra. He hid himself in plain sight. That's what people like him do. Every parent's worst nightmare is not only losing their child, but realizing the danger was far closer than they ever imagined. The team now feared that Rick J's obsession had likely been carefully planned for months. He didn't simply abduct Johanna out of impulse. One profiler said he orchestrated it. The timeline became clearer, but still incomplete. They now believed Rick had stalked Johanna for several months prior. He may have approached her casually before, earning small trust. The drawing Johanna mentioned to a friend that day may have been intended for him, presented innocently by a trusting child. The small details painted a chilling picture of psychological grooming. And yet, despite all of it, one question remained frozen. Had he kept her alive for any period? Could she have survived longer than anyone first believed? The presence of her belongings in multiple locations suggested movement. That alone kept hope alive in her mother's mind. He could have taken her somewhere else, maybe even out of the country, Lavara whispered during one of her many sleepless nights. As long as there's no body, I have to believe. Detectives knew this was possible, rare, but not impossible. Some child abduction cases in other countries had proven that children were kept hidden for years. The investigation team quietly expanded their reach. They began examining Rick J's distant travel history, old vacation bookings, rental records, and border crossings. Some small international trips surfaced, but none directly tied to Johanna. Still, every unexplained trip left more haunting possibilities. Had she been there? Had he moved her more than once? The detectives now lived in the same emotional limbo as Lavar herself. Until we find her, we have to work both cases missing and murdered, Karen said. Every night she sat at her desk, staring at the growing board of photos, timelines, maps, and legal files. In the middle of it all sat Johanna's photograph, still smiling, frozen at 8 years old. She whispered to herself every night, "We are not done." Because somewhere, in some file, some property, some forgotten detail, the silent witness was still waiting to speak one last time. By now, nearly 2 years had passed since the cold case team reopened Johanna's investigation. The evidence against Rick J was overwhelming: digital forensics, hidden footage, private files, obsession laid bare. And yet, without Johanna's body, the case still felt painfully incomplete. Rick J remained cold through every interrogation. He refused to admit to anything beyond what police had physically found. "I've told you everything," he repeated. Calmly, "I don't know where she is." This single sentence kept Lavara trapped inside her own private hell. If even he wouldn't admit she was dead, could she still be alive somewhere? But for the investigators, the silence itself was telling. "He's enjoying this," one profiler quietly noted. "The power, the control. He knows he's holding the one piece of truth no one can force from him." Karen, who had spent months leading the cold case team, felt the weight of every unsaid word. "He may never tell us," she whispered one night. Despite that, they kept pushing. The team now reviewed every inch of Rick's property history, places he lived, properties he visited, remote areas he had accessed over the past 20 years. One location stood out, a piece of private woodland Rick had once leased briefly around the time of Johanna's disappearance. At the time, authorities believed it was simply used for hunting and camping. It had never been searched in full detail. With new authorization in hand, search teams moved in. The dense forest was quiet and heavy with years of untouched overgrowth. Dogs swept the area. Ground radar teams began scanning, and then a hit. Roughly 50 meters into the woods, under a patch of disturbed earth masked by brush, the scanners picked up irregularities. Careful excavation began immediately. Underneath the shallow soil, they unearthed large plastic sheeting, sections of old rope, and several small personal items that once belonged to Johanna. Among them was a tiny charm bracelet she had worn often, one her mother recognized instantly. Karen stood silently as forensics carefully bagged the evidence. "It's hers," Lavra whispered through tears when shown the photos. And yet, still, there were no remains. The discovery only deepened the mystery. Had she been here at some point? Was this an earlier hiding place before she was moved? Or was it a failed burial site abandoned halfway? Even the forensics team couldn't say with certainty. The soil showed signs of being disturbed multiple times, years apart. Karen knew what this meant. "He may have moved her body at some point," she told her team, "either to hide evidence or because she was never buried here in the first place." The only thing everyone agreed on was that Rick J. had planned every part of this horror very carefully. He hadn't panicked. He had calculated. And yet, one piece of Rick's private puzzle remained locked away, his old bank deposit box. For years, Rick had quietly maintained a small safety deposit box at a private bank 2 towns away, opened just 3 weeks after Johanna's disappearance. Legal steps had delayed access for months. But now, with full court authorization, investigators finally gained entry. Inside the box, they found old cash, handwritten journals, and a small collection of personal trinkets. One of those items was unmistakably Johanna's, a tiny hand-painted ceramic figurine she had received as a gift on her last birthday. The discovery left no more room for reasonable doubt. Rick had not stumbled into Johanna's life. He had stalked her, groomed her, taken her, and preserved physical reminders of his control for nearly 2 decades. For Lavara, the hope she clung to now felt thinner than ever. And yet she still whispered the words she couldn't let go of. Maybe, just maybe, the investigation had one final place left to search. One final silent witness that might finally speak after 18 long years. And when it did, the full horror would finally be known. The search had reached its final corner. The deposit box confirmed everything investigators feared. But still, without Johanna's remains, the full truth remained incomplete. Until now. One member of the forensic team suggested one last approach: to review all aerial and satellite imagery of Rick J.'s known travel routes between 1999 and the early 2000s. Modern technology allowed them to process old satellite data that had never been analyzed before. And there, barely noticeable, they found it a small, remote private property deep within a neighboring forest reserve, leased briefly under an alias just months after Johanna's disappearance. The land had been untouched for years, hidden. Silent. The search team moved quickly. They arrived early, before dawn, as if afraid the evidence might vanish if daylight saw it. Deep within the property, partially concealed under years of foliage, they found a man-made depression in the earth. Dogs quickly signaled. The excavation was careful, deliberate, silent. No one spoke as the soil was slowly removed. At less than 4 feet below ground, the first piece appeared, a section of faded pink fabric. Further down, bone fragments, small, fragile, far too small for any adult. Then, unmistakable confirmation. Dental records matched the remains to Johanna Bonacker, 18 years after she disappeared. Her body had finally been found. The grief inside the command tent was suffocating. For Lavara, it was the call she feared most, but had prepared for every night for nearly 2 decades. Karen made the call herself. Lavra, we found her. There was silence on the other end for several long seconds, then only a whisper. Thank you for not giving up. The forensic pathologists worked carefully, respectfully. While decomposition had left little, they found enough to reconstruct some of Johanna's final moments. Based on the evidence, they concluded there were no major physical injuries at the time of death, no defensive wounds, no signs of blunt force trauma. The profiler's theory solidified. Rick J. hadn't taken Johanna intending to kill her immediately. He had wanted to possess her. The working theory revealed the horror. Rick likely abducted Johanna using grooming and manipulation. She may have initially believed she was safe, not fully understanding the danger. Over time, when Johanna resisted, panicked, or attempted escape, Rick escalated his control. The likely cause of death, asphyxiation. Whether accidental or intentional, investigators believe Johanna died while Rick was attempting to restrain her, possibly when she fought against him. What followed was even more disturbing. In the weeks after her death, Rick kept her remains hidden elsewhere, possibly within the same storage units already investigated. When the investigation pressure mounted back in 2000, Rick moved her to the remote burial site, using his secondary property to conceal her body indefinitely. Rick J's obsessive behaviors aligned with this timeline. The trophies, the digital recordings, the trinkets, they weren't only souvenirs. They were how he kept control of the memory, even long after Johanna was gone. When confronted with the discovery of the body, Rick J still refused to confess. You're making things up? I didn't do anything. But now his words didn't matter. The evidence was complete. Rick J was charged with murder, kidnapping, child endangerment, multiple charges related to illegal possession of abusive material and obstruction of justice. In court, the prosecutor laid out the full, horrifying timeline to the jury. The small, quiet man who had lived among them for nearly 2 decades sat expressionless. The jury took less than 4 hours. Rick J was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He would never leave prison walls again. As Lavra sat quietly in the courtroom, her hands trembling but steady, she finally felt what had been missing for 18 years, not peace, not healing, but truth. I prayed she might still be alive, she said. But if she couldn't be, at least now she's not lost anymore. Karen, standing outside the courthouse afterward, looked at the faces of the press gathered for the verdict. She said only one sentence. Sometimes the smallest, forgotten evidence is the loudest voice. And after 18 long years, Johanna had finally been found. The cemetery was quiet. The air felt stillness, not heavy, but calm. Johanna's small headstone stood beneath a tall oak tree, sunlight filtering through its branches like soft ribbons. The stone was simple, her name, her birth date, and beneath it, forever in our hearts. Lavra stood alone, as she had imagined doing for 18 years. Only this time the silence was different. It wasn't filled with questions. It wasn't screaming in the back of her mind. It was quiet because the waiting was finally over. Karen approached carefully, respecting the space between a mother and her daughter. After a moment, Lavra spoke softly. I used to dream she was still out there somewhere, and now I know where she is. I know she's not afraid anymore. Her voice trembled, but she didn't break. Karen placed her hand gently on Laura's shoulder. You gave her back her name, and you never stopped fighting for her. The investigation was officially closed. The courtroom had rendered its sentence. The evidence had spoken. The silent witness, that single forgotten fiber, had carried Johanna's voice forward when no one else could. Months later, a small memorial was placed near the old playground where Johanna had vanished so many years before. Children played nearby again. Life had returned, but her memory would always remain. For Lavra, grief would never fully disappear. But for the first time, she could live without the unbearable weight of wondering. I couldn't save her, she whispered one afternoon, but I never abandoned her. And sometimes that's the only peace there is.